Hello, everyone, and welcome along. Of all of the people that I've given this talk to, this is probably the most intimidating group because you'll all know as much, if not more than me, on many of slides that I share. So please forgive me if I make any mistakes or if I'm teaching anyone to suck eggs. But hopefully you'll enjoy it and hopefully you'll get something out of it. I'm somebody who's passionate both about geology and about history. So this sort of subject is the middle of the Venn diagram for me. And so I'm pleased to give this talk. And so we'll start with this picture here. So this is the Chilkoot Pass during the gold rush, and it's one of the most iconic images of the Klondike gold rush. And you can see this is a trail of people crossing over and into the Klondike to hopefully make their fortune. So you would have these queues that would go on for days and days. It would take people as they were lugging material over and across. And so we're going to find out together why they were doing this and how the gold rush came about. So brief contents. I'll skip through my background because Patrick gave a lovely introduction. I'll talk a bit about the geology of the Yukon and the Klondike to get people's eyes in. I'll give you some of the historical setting for the gold rush, and then I'll talk about the gold rush itself, how it came to an end and what happened afterwards. And then as you guys are more on the mining side, I will try and whiz through so we can get to the last few slides where I can tell you a little bit about the work that I did out there, and hopefully some of you will see it as familiar. Okay, so where is the Yukon? Up, it's one of the two territories of Canada. It's up close to the Alaskan border. A lot of it is above the Arctic Circle, or a chunk of it is above the Arctic Circle, and it's one of the least populated areas of Canada. It's very wild and yeah. So the bedrock geology of the Yukon. So what's the setting that we're talking about? So a modern analog is probably something like the Japanese islands and the Ryukyu Trench. So we're talking about a back arc environment, an oceanic arc environment, and each of the terrains that we're looking at in Canada are historic remnants of a previous arc system. We can see that running sort of northwest to southeast, there is a series of terrains, and each of these terrains broadly coincide with one of these genetic environments that we can see up here. So the main bit that we're interested in is the Yukon-Tanana terrain, which is an arc accretionary bit of geology, and it's a basal succession of metasedimentary rocks. So the actual goldfields themselves are located southwest of the Tintana Fault, and it's a major right lateral strike slip fault along which about 450 kilometres of displacement has occurred since the mid-Cretaceous. So the goldfields themselves are mainly underlaid by medium to high grade polydeformed Paleozoic metasedimentary rocks and some metaigneous rocks belonging to this terrain. Drift geology. So one of the interesting features of the Yukon, and one that probably surprises a lot of people, is it's not very glaciated. This is because the rainfall levels are pretty low comparatively to many other regions. So even though it's very, very cold, it's historically been pretty dry, and this has meant that instead of having big U-shaped valleys or the traditional things that we see in an alpine environment, we have rounded slopes and we have a gradual riverine erosion of those hills, and all of that material, all that gravel that comes from that erosion pretty much stays in place and along the riversides. It's not dragged away by the glaciers. So you'll often find that the gold-bearing gravels are very close to the environment in which they were eroded from. So if you look in the actual goldfields themselves, this was when I was doing my geological mapping. So I had 7 very similar looking schists, and I became very familiar with each of these slight variations, and would map that out across. So the type of gold that we're looking at, it's orogenic gold. So it's a hydrothermal mineral deposit. About 75% of all gold recovered by humans belongs to this class of deposits. They're primarily hosted in shear zones within orogenic belts, and the deposits themselves form during scintillate metamorphic stages of orogeny. So the structural evolution and geometry of the lithospheric crust play a really crucial role in the formation. So hydrothermal fluids migrate through pre-existing and active discontinuities, such as faults, shears, and lithological boundaries that are generated by tectonic processes. And these discontinuities provide pathways for fluid flow, including ore-bearing fluids and metallic elements such as silver, arsenic, mercury, and antimony. So the gold-bearing fluids themselves precipitate at upper crustal level, so that's usually 3 to 15 kilometers depth, and they're usually as vertical extensive quartz veins. It's really important as well to look at the structural geology of the area to find out where the gold comes from. So this is Professor Mortensen, who I worked with when I was out there, and he put together the sort of structural context of the Klondike goldfields. And what's really important is particular deformation events are associated with occur before and after the gold precipitation. So if you can identify these structural features and how they interact, you can predict in the actual lode deposits themselves where you might find the gold. So I'll whiz through this because I'm sure this is very familiar to people, but when we talk about how a placer is formed, a residual placer is essentially when it erodes out of the rock face, out of the gold vein, and it's left in place. An alluvial placer is when it's on the move, usually due to gravity, and an alluvial placer is when it's reached the river courses. Generally, the gold is found in places where there is a sudden drop in velocity. So that could be behind rock bars, it could be on the inside of meanders, it could be below waterfalls, or where 2 rivers meet. So those are the sort of key places that you would be looking to find gold. And gold in the Yukon, it's part of a much wider industry. There's lots and lots of other economic geology going on in the Yukon that you can see in this map. Okay, so let's get into the background to the gold rush itself. So at the very early stages, before the gold rush occurred, we're still in this age of exploration. So people are still trying to find their ways through the Northwest Passage had only really just been discovered, and much of Canada itself is particularly up into the Yukon is been unsettled by Westerners. There are just there are a few Russian settlers that are selling pelts and furs, and there are a few sort of intrepid exploration geologists and prospectors that are starting to move their way up northwards. So when we're looking at the gold rushes themselves, the very first major gold rush in North America was in North Carolina in 1803. You can see in red here. Georgia in 1828. The very famous Californian gold rush in 1848, so in the middle of the century. British Columbia following that, and we started to move northwards and inland. So we had Colorado, Nevada in 1859, Wyoming 1867, South Dakota, North Dakota, Idaho in 1890, and then Montana 1892, and 1896 being the Yukon Gold Rush. So when we're talking about the Yukon Gold Rush, it's sort of the very last major one in North America, and it's the transition between traditional methods of mining and modern methods of mining, and it's the first one where there's electric lighting. It's the first one where there's some of these modern technologies that are used in it, and it's almost the last hurrah of the great gold rushes in America. So the first forays into the Yukon, as I was saying, it's traders, it's fur traders, and it's the odd prospector who's sort of chancing their way up the rivers. They're moving into an area that's populated by the local Klondike people. So they've lived in this region for at least 14,000 years, and they were in the 1890s. They were largely oblivious to Canada, the Dominion of Canada in Ottawa, and the border with the United States. For these people, whose population numbered about 5,000, this was a traditional territory, and it was a homeland rich in game, fish, and berries. Concepts of land ownership were relatively meaningless to them, and they lived here with a sort of dependence on the rhythms of the seasons. So the name Klondike, it comes from a sort of bastardization of the word Trondek, which the tro in that means a special rock or a hammer that they use to drive salmon stakes for collecting fish into the river, and then Nadek means a waterway, a river. So Klondike is sort of the river of the salmon people, something along those lines. So on August the 16th, 1896, an American prospector named George Carmack and two Tagish men, so the native and the Canadian First Nations people, one named Skookum Jim and one named Tagish Charlie. They were travelling together southwards along the Klondike River. Following a suggestion from a Canadian prospector named Robert Henderson, they began looking for gold on Bonanza Creek, that you can see down here. It was then called Rabbit Creek, and it was one of the many tributaries of the Klondike. It's not clear who discovered the gold. It could have been George Carmack or Skookum Jim, but the group agreed to let George Carmack appear as the official discoverer because they feared that the authorities wouldn't recognise an indigenous claimant. But in any event, the gold was present along the rivers in huge quantities. Carmack measured out 4 claims, strips of ground that could be later legally mined, and this included 2 for himself, one as his normal claim, and the second as a reward for having discovered the gold, and 1 each for Jim and Charlie. And they were registered the next day at the police post at the mouth of the 40-mile river. And then from then, the news rapidly spread to other mining camps in the valley. So here you can see a map of where the discovery claim was. So the remoteness of Dawson City proved to be an ongoing problem for the supply of food. I think I must have skipped a slide here. Apologies, sorry. I'm going to jump ahead and then I'm going to go back, if that's okay. So, once, apologies, guys. I think I've put some slides wrong here, but I'll wing it. So basically, over that very first winter, you were getting just the local prospectors who had heard from the Carmacks that there was gold available to be had in and around the Klondike area, and so you had a sudden influx of people that were coming from all those local sites, and they arrived just before the winter set in. And once the winter did set in, they suddenly realised that they had no access to clean water, they had no access to supplies, and so many people that had been prospecting, building great mounds of pay dirt, ready to mine in the spring suddenly found that they had nothing to eat and no ways of keeping themselves. So you started to see things like eggs being sold for hundreds of dollars an egg. And some people were found in the springtime frozen in their homes with what would have been millions of dollars of gold casually piled up outside that they couldn't get access to. They couldn't work because they'd frozen over the winter. So that very first winter was very tough. So how did they stake a mining claim there? Well, it's pretty much the same as it is today. And up until a few years ago, you did exactly the same. You took a wooden stake out, you went to the edges of the area that you wanted to claim, and you stuck a post in the ground, put your name on it, and registered it with the local mining office. So you would generally have a 250 feet length of the river in a straight line, and then you could go backwards by 100 feet, so 50 feet either side of the river, and that was the size of your claim. So when we get past the spring and we get into the start of year 2, the word's getting out. So the steamships, the steamship Excelsior, it docks in San Francisco in July 1897, and there are millionaires on board because they've got gold in jars, bags, satchels, and 5,000 people are on those docks watching all these prospectors arrive. A few days later, the steamship Portland, it lands in Seattle, and that has 86 miners on board who had between them over a ton of gold. So the word reaches the papers, and within days, thousands are flocking to these coastal towns trying to book passage north to the Klondike. And the economic depression of the 1890s was really a fertile ground for these chancers to kind of try to make it rich. So there's different routes you could get into the Klondike. So it could be reached only along the Yukon River, either upstream from its delta or downstream from its head, or you could meet it somewhere in the middle through the tributaries. Riverboats could navigate the Yukon in the summer from the delta until a point now known as Whitehorse. Travel in general was difficult, made so by both the terrain and the climate. The region is very mountainous, the rivers are winding, and sometimes they're impassable. The short summers could be quite hot, and the winters very cold, and the rivers frozen over. Aid for the travellers to carry their supplies varied. Some had brought dogs, horses, mules, or oxen, whereas others had to rely on carrying their equipment on their backs or on sleds pulled by hand. Shortly after the stampede began in 1897, the Canadian authorities had introduced rules requiring anyone that entered the Yukon Territory to bring with them a year's supply of food, and that would weigh around 1,100 pounds or 500 kilograms. So by the time camping equipment, tools, and other essentials were included, a typical traveller could often be transporting as much as a ton in weight. Unsurprisingly, the price of draft animals soared. At Dyer and at Skagway, even poor quality horses could sell for as much as $1,900 in today's money, or they could be rented out for $1,000 a day. So from Seattle or San Francisco, the prospectors could travel by sea up the coast to the ports of Alaska. And the route that followed the coast is generally referred to as the Inside Passage. It led to the ports of Dyer and Skagway and the start of the nearby trails. Let's go on to the next one. So here you can see on the left, I don't know if you can make out this, but this is a list of everything that you were required to have when you entered the Yukon by the Canadian government. So all sorts of 150 pounds of bacon in there, 150 pounds of split peas, hand saws, jack planes, wash basins, picks, towels, and these would be checked before you passed over the mountain. You could also get passage from Europe. So with the advent of the telegraph, the message reached Europe very quickly, and they were selling tickets to Vancouver and so thousands of people passed from Europe across to Canada. So there was what was called the rich man's route, or the all water route. So you could sail from the Klondike, first from Seattle, across the northern Pacific to the Alaskan coast, and from the town of St. Michael at the Yukon River Delta, you could then get a riverboat all the way up the river to Dawson, and that would often be guided by one of the native Yukon people who live near St. Michael. And even though this water route was called the rich man's route, it was expensive and it was long, and it had the attraction of avoiding overland travel. At the beginning of a stampede, you could buy a ticket for about $150 or $4,000 today, but by the second winter, that had risen to $27,000. So the Inside Passage. So here we go. So we're looking here at the inlet. At the inlet here at the sea. So you've got Dyer on the American side. Sorry, you've got Skagway on the American side, and you've got Dyer on the Canadian side, and you've got essentially two passes available to you. So Dyer was a much more civilized one, run by the Canadian Mounties. This, you can see, this was all the gear packed up there, whereas Skagway was known as a bit of a hotbed, and a little bit more rough and ready. So it was famously described as a nest of ants taken into a strange country and stirred up by a stick. So it became infamous in international media. While Dyer remained a transit point through the winter, Skagway had a more sort of permanent character. They built wharves out into the bay to attract a greater share of prospectors, but the town itself was effectively lawless. It was dominated by drinking, gunfire, and prostitution. The visiting NWMP superintendent noted that it was little better than hell on earth, about the roughest place in the world. Nonetheless, by the summer of 1898, it had a population, including migrants, of between 15,000 and 20,000, and it became the largest city in Alaska briefly. In early 1898, it fell under the control of Jefferson Randolph Soapy Smith and his men, and they had arrived from Seattle shortly after Skagway began to expand. He was an American confidence trickster, and his gang, 200 to 300 strong, cheated and stole from the prospectors traveling in the region. He maintained the illusion of being an upstanding member of the community. He opened 3 saloons, as well as creating fake businesses to assist his operations. One of his scams was fake telegraph office that would charge to send messages all over the US and abroad, and often pretending to receive a reply, but just taking in the money. Opposition to Smith, he gradually grew, and after weeks of vigilante activity, he was killed in a shootout in Skagway on Juneau Wharf in July 1898. See, here's a photograph of me going to visit the Soapy Smith's grave. So those that landed at Skagway made their way over the White Pass before crossing across to Bennett Lake. Even though the trail began gently, it progressed over several mountains with paths as narrow as 2 feet wide, and some of these were covered in boulders and sharp rocks. Under these conditions, horses died in huge numbers, and it gave the route an informal name of the Dead Horse Trail. The volumes of travellers and the wet weather began to make the trail impassable, and by late 1897 it was closed until further notice, leaving about 5,000 people stranded in Skagway. An alternative toll road suitable for wagons was eventually constructed, and this, combined with colder weather that froze the muddy ground, began to allow the White Pass to reopen. Okay. So those that landed at Dyer, and that was Skagway's neighbour, they could travel along the Chilkoot Pass, and this one crossed over the mountains to Lake Lindeman. So the Chilkoot Pass was higher than the White Pass, but more used it, around 22,000 during the gold rush. It passed up through various camps until it reached a flat ledge just before this main ascent that was too steep for animals. This location was known as the Scales, and this is where the goods were weighed before travellers officially entered Canada. The cold, the steepness, and the weight of equipment could make this climb extremely arduous, and it could take a day to get to the top of the 300-metre high slope. As on the White Pass Trail, supplies needed to be broken down into smaller packages and carried in a relay. Packers prepared to carry the supplies for cash were available on the route, but many would charge up to $27 per pound. And many of the and later stages there were avalanches, and these were quite common. And one of them claimed the lives of more than 60 people that were travelling over the Chilkoot Pass. Eventually, entrepreneurs began to find solutions. So steps were cut into the ice, which could be used for a daily fee. And this 1,500 step staircase became known as the Golden Stairs. And by December, a gentleman called Archie Burns had built a tramway up the final part of the pass. And a horse at the bottom would turn a wheel that pulled a rope, running back and forth. And freight was loaded into sledges that were pulled by the rope. Eventually, 5 more tramways followed, and then eventually a steam engine. You can see the one here, and that was able to be used for between $2 and $8 a pound, and it could move up to 9 tons of goods an hour up to the summit. So after people had travelled these 2 passes, they reached these lakes at the top, Lake Bennett and Lake Lindeman. So they waited there in tented camps for the thaw in spring because they couldn't navigate the river down to Dawson City whilst it was frozen. So there was up to 10,000 people waiting at each lake, and they were trying to get their hands on almost anything that would float. So there's lots of rapids on the way down to Dawson City that you'd have to navigate, and quite often these would be pretty treacherous, and boats would capsize. So quite often they would abandon the boat, walk along the side, push it down, and hope that it remained in one piece to retrieve at the other side. But when they got to Dawson City, many of them would have severe disappointment because most of the stakes were claimed by those early arrivals from the first year or 2. And the remaining rivers and creeks around them had very little gold left, or very little gold on them. So the late arrivals milled around, they looked for jobs. Many found jobs as labourers in saloons, timber yards, but many were just so despondent that they'd been promised all this quick buck that they sold up and left. But Dawson City itself then became a boom town. So Joe Ledoux and shopkeeper Arthur Harper set up Dawson City itself. In the spring of 1898, the Dawson population, including the surrounding goldfields, rose to about 30,000 people as the stampeders arrived over the passes. The centre of the town, Front Street, was lined with hastily built buildings and warehouses, together with log cabins and tents spread out across the rest of the settlement. There's no running water, or sewerage, and the only 2 springs for drinking water gradually became polluted. In spring, the unpaved streets were churned into thick mud, and in the summer, the settlement reeked of human filth and was plagued by flies and mosquitoes, so not a great place to be living. Plots were selling for up to $280,000 in modern money. And the newly built town proved very vulnerable to fire. So houses were made of wood and heated with cheap stoves and lit by candles and oil lamps. The first major fire occurred on November the 25th, 1897, accidentally started by a dance hall girl, Belle Mitchell. She also happened to accidentally start another major fire the next year, and because there was an absence of a fire brigade, she destroyed 2 major saloons, the post office, the Bank of British North America, and they estimated it cost up to $14 million in damage. And the worst fire occurred on April 26, 1899, this time not by Bell, when a saloon caught fire in the middle of the city, and over 117 buildings were either burnt or damaged beyond repair. So again, lots of things going on there. That I put this photograph in because the richest person in Dawson City was the person who ran the sawmill, because all the gold prospectors would often spend their money, and they'd make a lot of money in the gold from gold, but they'd be spending it in the saloons or on gambling. But yes, still to this day, the sort of richest family in the Dawson area are the descendants of the people who set up the sawmill. So how did they extract gold in the small scale? So you would dig a shaft through the muck and through into the alluvial gravel, and you would often, at the beginning, it would be as simple as lighting a fire in the bottom of the drift and trying to melt the gravel, and then pulling it by bucket up to the surface, ready to be mined. As time progressed and people brought more equipment in, they would then start to use a steam boiler with a steam point and a pipe to do this more efficiently. You could then use sluices, rocker boxes, and just standard panning to extract the gold. You could use jet washers to wash the riversides to clear as much of that pay dirt ready to be mined. But the major thing that makes extracting that placid gold difficult is the distribution of permafrost. So large chunks of Canada either have continuous permafrost or discontinuous permafrost. So particularly on the north slopes of the mountains, you'll find the permafrost very close to the surface, and this makes extracting difficult. When I was working out there, we were taking soil samples across the whole area, and you would find that within a foot of the surface, you would hit the permafrost on north slopes. You could usually get down to the gravel at 2 or 3 foot on the southern facing slope, but it was a very difficult and laborious process. I'll skip through this. So permafrost itself, it's causes all sorts of problems in this region. So if you can see, these are the old buildings from the original gold rush, and you can see how they were built directly onto the ground, and this caused melting of the permafrost beneath, and the buildings starting to tilt. So the modern way of avoiding that, so you'll see all the new buildings in Dawson are built on stilts, and they allow air to pass underneath. So Dawson City, there was lives of excess. So there was huge quantities of gold coming through the town, and it had encouraged lavish lifestyles amongst the prospectors. Some of them could spend $28,000 a day playing poker, and people would elaborately show their wealth. So Jimmy McMahon, he spent $784,000 in a single evening of gambling, and most payments were made in gold dust. And you could, in fact, in many of the saloons, there was money to be made just by sweeping the floor after a night and collecting the gold that had been dropped. So why did the gold rush end? Firstly, there's 2 questions. Did the gold rush end? That's question 1. And 2, if it did, why did it end? So the answer to the first question is, in the traditional sense, i.e. with thousands of people arriving and panning on a small artisanal scale, yes, it did end. But in terms of the gold extraction and the use of this area, it continued. In fact, it increased the amount of gold that was being taken, but it was much smaller. All those smaller operations were coalesced into companies that would then buy up multiple shares, multiple locations, and run it together. So some of the reasons why the main gold rush ended. So by 1898, we had telegraphy that stretched from Skagway to Dawson City, and this allowed instant international contact. By 1898, the railway had been built, and when it was completed, the tramways and the Chilkoot Pass became obsolete. But despite these improvements in communication, the rush faltered from 1898. It began in the summer of 1898 when one of the prospectors arriving from Dawson City found themselves, when many of the prospectors found themselves unable to make a living and left. For those that stayed, the wages of casual work dropped considerably, and the world's newspapers were beginning to turn against the gold rush as well. By the spring of 1898, the Spanish-American War removed the Klondike from the headlines. Another factor in the decline was the change in Dawson City. It developed through 1898, turning from a ramshackle town into a wealthy boom town and a more sort of sedate, conservative municipality. So modern luxuries were introduced, and many of those prospectors that were more attracted by the wilder ways of living decided to move on and headed out up into further into Alaska. So there's some pictures of the Yukon Railroad, and then after the initial gold rush itself, we started to move into much more large scale mining. So these are some of the dredges that work the river. So these things are 4 or 5 story buildings, and they can be run by as few as 4 people. Somebody to run the winches, people on the shore to direct them, and somebody to power it from the inside. So you can go visit these. There's still one there. I think you can still go inside. They're really fascinating. Some pictures there. And then post the gold rush, I can say there's been a commodity cycle. So gold has shot up and shot down in price over the years, and with each of these commodity cycles, you get a spike in interest in heading to the Klondike. So modern prospecting. So when I was there, a lot of the placer mining was actually just going over the old tailings. So here you can see an image of the Klondike River, and you can see all these worm-like structures. These are the tailings from those big dredgers. You were talking about yields from it. Maybe 70% of the gold was able to be taken out originally, which left about 30% left available to be remined later. So a lot of the sort of prospectors in the 2010s and more recently were just rerunning the old tailings to get the remaining gold out of it with modern techniques. So I think, Patrick, I will